Welcome back to another episode of Thinking Critically. Today I am joined by Dr. John Cook, who is a research assistant professor at the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University. His research focus is understanding and countering misinformation about climate change, with an emphasis on using critical thinking to build resilience. He founded Skeptical Science and authored the book Cranky Uncle versus Climate Change, combining climate science, critical thinking, and cartoons to explain and counter climate misinformation. He also co-authored the college textbooks Climate Change, Examining the Facts, and Climate Change Science, A Modern Synthesis, and the book Climate Change Denial, Heads in the Sand. Anyway, John, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, I always kind of do this with scientists, is I'm just really curious to hear kind of your journey into science. I want to know like how you started this whole journey. When did you first become interested in science?
When did I become interested in science? Well, being a nerd all the way in, I can't remember a time when I wasn't interested in science, but I went straight from high school into doing a physics degree. So it was always a given that I would, it was a foregone conclusion that I would study science. And even when I finished my physics degree and I left academia, I left science and, did other things, did graphic design, did cartooning for a while. Gradually science pulled me back in again. It's like The Godfather.
So you tried to move away, but you just kind of got sucked in by science's strong gravitational field. Said,
exactly.
This is what I need to do now. So you said you have an undergraduate degree in physics, and I'm curious as to how you decided that that's the area of science that you wanted to go into. So obviously there's a bunch of different areas that you can go into, but like how was physics kind of like, yes, this is the science that I want to do as an undergraduate at least?
Yeah, gee, that's going back. I have to think about the thought processes. I remember at the time I was interested in AI, so I was looking a lot at computer science. And in my first year, I did a bit of computer science, a bit of physics, a bit of maths. The maths just freaked me. It was like another universe, and the maths lecturers at the university were like these alien creatures, and I decided, well, physics is a lot easier than mathematics, so let's go the easy route. So
which is interesting because obviously as somebody who does a physics degree, you actually need quite a bit of mathematics. I suppose it's not as quite abstract and esoteric though as like pure math, where you're kind of living.
Yeah. Like with physics, the mathematics is there to facilitate these physical concepts that you're grappling with, and so I guess it's grounding. The abstract is kind of being grounded with these concrete concepts to a degree, yeah, at least.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I, as somebody who also studied physics, I can definitely relate with the being drawn to more or appreciating more of the applied math, the mathematics that can be taken and then used to understand the world better versus kind of going off in your own alternate dimension or own universe where you're manipulating these abstract symbols and it's not really attached to reality at all. And I know a mathematician might take offense to that, but I mean, I think to a degree you have to admit that pure math, if you can't attach pure math to reality, then you're just kind of pushing symbols around at some point, solving fun puzzles.
Yeah, the exception to the rule being maybe quantum mechanics, where the mathematics there was and the concepts were all pretty out there. I remember that subject in my fourth year being really challenging.
I can relate. Yeah, I think that in graduate school, like out of all of the physics courses that I ever took, the only physics classes that I really got B's in was quantum mechanics, because it's so abstract and I had a hard time like wrapping my mind around what exactly is going on because you can't really visualize anything. So with the other types of physics, you can, to a degree, visualize what is going on. But when you get to quantum mechanics, you're talking about things that operate on a atomic level, so you obviously can't see them. It's very hard to you can't really visualize it either. So you develop more of like a mathematical, I suppose, intuition when you're working with quantum mechanics versus the physical intuition that you develop when you're working with other aspects of physics. But yeah, no, I can definitely relate with the quantum mechanics being super abstract and difficult. But anyway, yes, okay, so physics as an undergraduate, and then did you go on, you decided at some point, you're like, you know what, I want to go on and get a graduate degree, so you have a PhD, obviously. So did you go straight through then? Like, did you go bachelor's, then into graduate school, maybe a master's first, then a PhD, or did you take a break after
I
after
took
you
a
got your
long
bachelor's?
break, and it wasn't even a break. It was finishing academia, and I
After your
moved
bachelor's degree?
into just working in in business. Well, not business so much, but doing graphic design, doing website design and databases, and cartooning. Like I was during my physics degree, I was drawing a lot of cartoons in
Okay.
my physics notes, and I wanted to. There was that kind of element of science and art, and I wanted to pursue the art direction for a bit at least. And so I was doing this as a career. I was working full time doing design and cartoons, and in my spare time, I started building a website about climate change, just as a hobby, as something that I was interested in, and it was that process of running a website about climate science and really doing a science communication task. It was like I was doing public engagement and trying to explain physics and climate science to the public. And it was several years into that, I learned that there was a whole science to science communication. And that eye-opening, I guess, revelation is what was the precipitating event to pulling me back into academia and eventually doing a PhD.
That's fascinating. So okay, so you got your bachelor's degree. You had a hobby of cartooning, and you really
No,
enjoyed
a
art.
career of cartooning.
Yeah, you did it. Okay, so you had it wasn't like graphic design career in particular. You said you actually like were making money off of creating cartoons then as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
I was doing comic strips in newspapers
okay.
and a website that was making some income from advertising, and did that for about a decade. I was pretty much working full time as a cartoonist for roughly a decade.
Okay. That's fascinating. Okay, so the website that you're referring to, I'm assuming, is Skeptical Science then, the climate change website?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
And wow, okay. Did you like draw for the school newspaper? Like you had your own strip in the school newspaper and everything? Or did you?
When I was at university back during undergrad.
Okay.
Is that your question?
Yeah. I was just, I was curious if you actually had like a column in your school newspaper. Because
I
I
did.
remember.
Yeah, I did draw, I think, one or two cartoons for the school magazine. They weren't very good in hindsight, but it's a university magazine. I think the standards were quite low, and they were really weird uni stuff.
Okay.
So,
Well, I mean, you got to get started somewhere, right? So
exactly.
you got started in your undergraduate. You were in the school newspaper, and you got your first kind of taste for what it means to create comic strips for an audience. Uh, okay, that's really fascinating. So, skeptical science, you know, with your undergraduate in physics, I don't like I don't remember global warming being talked a whole lot in the physics department. Probably more in the geology department. Where did your passion kind of for global warming develop? That you were like concerned about it? I mean, I know that the entire scientific community, it's something that is on everyone's mind, but like, why did you decide that you needed to create skeptical science to go out there and like communicate the science of global warming?
Yeah, climate change wasn't on my radar at all during university. Although once I was digging through my old notes and I found an assignment I wrote, I think in 1992, I think it was an oceanography class about global warming, and I think it was just asking, is global warming happening? And I think that, if I recall correctly, the conclusion was in my essay, maybe. So
Okay.
it wasn't on my radar until much later. It was really around 2007, and that's when a lot of people started taking notice. I think Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth brought a lot of attention to the issue. The IPCC brought out a report, I think, in 2007, and it just really opened a lot of people's eyes. I started getting into conversations with family members, including my father-in-law, who was a vociferous climate denier. He was firmly against it. And so we would have these lunches, family lunches, where he would be arguing against global warming and arguing that it's a hoax. And after one of these lunches, I went home and started researching all the different arguments he gave and realized, actually, no, what he did, that's right, after lunch, he left the room and then he came back with a printout. And the printout was a speech by Oklahoma Senator James Inhofe, where he basically argued that global warming was the biggest hoax perpetrated on the American public. And it's kind of weird that, we're in Australia, we're on the other side of the world, and he's printing out a speech by a senator. And I thought, well, a senator sounds like an important, reputable person, so there must be some substance to this argument, right? I was very naive back then. And so when I started researching the arguments in Inhofe's speech, I realized that there was very little science in his arguments about climate change. And the scientific arguments that he did have in there were all wrong. They're all basically misinformation. And so as a competitive son-in-law, anticipating the next family get-together, I started building a list of the possible arguments that I might encounter in the next get-together. And then what did the science say about each one? And basically building a database of climate myths and the peer-reviewed science relative to each climate myth. And that personal database eventually became skeptical science. I realized that other people had fathers-in-laws or cranky uncles or family members or friends or colleagues that denied climate science, and they might find this collection of peer-reviewed climate science a useful resource.
Yeah, that's I'm sure that there's a lot of people that can relate with what you just said, where you have a family member or perhaps a close friend who is using these flawed arguments in order to justify their positions. And this is very common, and I can definitely relate to this personally, because I actually was one of those people where I didn't want to acknowledge these scientific consensus around genetically modified food safety or even vaccine safety. And that's really hard for me to say as a science person, but I had convinced myself at some point that the science wasn't settled. And it was still earlier in my scientific training, so I didn't really understand science on a deeper level, how it worked. I just kind of knew how to do it at a superficial level. So I knew enough to be dangerous, is what I tell people. And
could I ask a question?
Yeah.
Was there often people deny science because they're motivated for some reason, whether it's political ideology or religious beliefs or their social group that they belong to?
Yes.
Do you think that there was anything in particular that was predisposing you to be skeptical of vaccines? Or
Yes, absolutely. And I've talked about this at length on the website and on social media and whatnot. But I grew up to a parent that got involved who was a dentist, and then they at some point got involved with the complementary and alternative medicine crowd. So I was at one point was actually working in that community, involved with them regularly, and there is strong anti-science sentiments. And I, being a science person, I was trying to dig through the science and trying to figure out why it is that these positions were as controversial, I guess. Is there really something going on here? Why does this community not believe these things? And in particular, why does my one parent not acknowledge the consensus surrounding these vaccine safety and genetically modified food safety? So I was digging through it, and I would engage in cherry picking regularly, finding these scientific studies that were published in fringe journals, or perhaps the conclusions weren't pointing to the conclusions that I actually thought thought that was actually being said. I thought it was supporting my position, but it was really not doing that. It was not supporting my position at all, even though I thought it was. But I think at the end of the day, John, it was mostly trying to fit in. As you know, the psychology of it all, when you are, as a human wanting to fit into a group, and then you're willing to, I guess, justify certain beliefs in order to fit in. And also having a parent too, somebody that you have a lot of respect for, that raised you, you want to justify to a degree their positions as well. So, and again too, I didn't really have the scientific training. So the justification was trying to fit in and also to justify my parents' position, my one parent's position on it, and then also not having the scientific training in order to understand why these positions are flawed, engaging in cherry picking, things of that nature. I didn't have, while I was trained in science, I didn't have a strong philosophy background in logic, things of that nature, argumentation. That was something that I had to teach myself. And eventually, when I started hitting brick walls with people arguing online, like on Reddit or on Facebook, because I couldn't argue my positions, I eventually got led into logic, learning about cognitive biases, how do you structure a good argument, etc. And that's what this platform is now, because I just wish it was more widely taught than it is. And I can't really understand for the life of me why it isn't. And even as somebody who went through the scientific training process, I feel as though I was slighted a bit, because I don't understand why I didn't have philosophy education mandatory, particularly logic or maybe philosophy of science or something of that nature as a part of my scientific training, to just give me a better foundational understanding of how science is structured, essentially, and why we know that the results that come out the back end of it have the best chances of reflecting reality. So, but anyway, that's kind of a long-winded response to your inquiry. But yeah, at the end of the day, it was trying to fit in, I guess. That was the justification, was trying to fit in, and also wanting to look highly upon my one particular parent.
Cool. I mean, social pressures are incredibly highly influential and more influential than people realize. There's plenty of research showing that it can be almost overwhelming in terms of influencing people's behavior and beliefs. So, and in climate change now, because the issue has become polarized, now it essentially is social pressure or political affiliation is the biggest driver of climate denial. So it's fitting in with what your tribe believes.
Yes, and it's really, really unfortunate, the politicization of science, because science is the best epistemological framework that we have for learning about our world and understanding it and making good decisions. I mean, how do you make good policy decisions if you're not going to listen to what the science has to tell you?
Mm-hmm.
It just becomes impossible at some point. And particularly with global warming, I think what is so alarming to me is that it has become adopted by an entire political party in the United States as their position. And while they may not come out, the majority of them may not come out and overtly say these things, that, or maybe they will, I don't know. But even so, there's some that overtly say it, and then there's plenty that just kind of follow along. And I know plenty of individuals today who align with this party, and then all of a sudden they adopt these things as well. And that is incredibly damaging, because personally, I don't know how you feel about it, but with global warming, I think it's one of the greatest problems that we've ever faced as a species, in the last, I don't know, 100,000 years or something of that nature. It's just the dangers that it poses to society and our way of life and the health of the planet in general. It's just really alarming. So
I feel exactly the same way, which is why I've pretty much dedicated my life to addressing one of the biggest roadblocks to climate action, which is misinformation.
Yes. So bachelor's degree, then you took a break and then started the website. skeptical science. You're doing that, creating these awesome, your cartoons are great, by the way. Creating these informative cartoons, getting out there, debunking arguments and misinformation along the way through your cartoons, through the website, listing arguments and why they're wrong. And then you get pulled back into science. At what point do you decide to go back and get your PhD? And then you don't have a PhD in physics, or do you?
No.
No. So you just go back, and your PhD is in cognitive science. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Okay, wonderful. So how did you decide then, that you wanted to do cognitive science, and that because all of this science communication, you're like, hey, you know what? I got to go back. I just got to do it.
So firstly, the cartoons, using cartoons against misinformation, I didn't do that for quite a while. That actually came after the PhD. But after I'd been doing skeptical science for several years, and I really came at it from the perspective of a natural scientist with a physics background. I had a very simplistic understanding of what public engagement about climate science or science communication was. It was really about you explain the facts to people and their attitudes and behaviors will change accordingly. Very much an information deficit model approach. People don't have the right information, give them the information and it's problem solved. Several years into running my website with this approach, I received an email from a cognitive scientist from the University of Western Australia, Stefan Lewandowski, and he sent me some research into debunking misinformation. What the research found was if you debunk misinformation in the wrong way, it can be ineffective or it can even be counterproductive and potentially cause a backfire effect where people see the misinformation, read your debunking, and then come away after the debunking believing the myth even more than before they read the debunking. And when I looked at the bad way of debunking misinformation, it was exactly the same way that I was doing it on skeptical science. So just reading that research paper just was a complete shock to the system. It opened my eyes not only to this existence of scientific research into how to debunk, but also the fact that if you don't do it right, you could make matters worse. And so that ended up being a life-changing email. I started diving into the research, trying to educate myself on the best ways to debunk misinformation. Pretty quickly from that, I collaborated with Stefan Lewandowski to create a debunking handbook. And then I asked him if he was interested in being my PhD supervisor and starting a PhD research in how to more effectively debunk climate misinformation.
So it was actually, you said it was Lewandowski, Stephen Lewandowski, that reached out to you then and sent you all of this information?
He emailed me and changed my life, basically.
That's fascinating. That's really, really fascinating. So I'm curious as to how you were approaching debunking misinformation on your website prior to Stephen sending you the research, elucidating essentially that you were doing it the wrong way.
I was basically doing it the way a lot of fact checkers still do it now, which is putting the emphasis on the myth rather than putting the emphasis on the facts that you want to communicate. So the headline of my debunkings was the myth, and then I would restate the myth in a red box, and then I would have a long, complicated article debunking it. And the danger with that is details fade. So people might read the whole thing and they would understand it and accept it and believe it, and you would successfully reduce belief in the myth. But over time, as the details fade, all they might remember is the headline, and particularly older participants. And so this initial research, published I think in 2007, found that older participants ended up believing the myth more after a delay. But I should really stress that this backfire effect has failed to replicate. And so since that moment when I thought, oh my God, am I making things worse? There's been a lot of research published in the decade since. And especially research trying to replicate these backfire effects. And there are a range of different ones. And most of the research has failed to replicate it. And so the general sense in the misinformation research community now is backfire effects are not the boogeyman that we thought they were. And we shouldn't let fear of backfire effects prevent us from engaging with misinformation. The bigger danger is that we leave misinformation unchallenged.
Yeah, I've also come across that as well with the backfire effect being non-replicable, that it may still be there, but it's really not as big as we initially thought it was, so that when you are engaging in debunking, that you don't have to worry about the people walking away having a stronger position than they did before, which is a relief, to be honest with you, because like you said, here you are thinking that you are doing something good, right? Trying to get the facts out there, debunking the myths, and then you see this research, and I think you can make yourself feel really bad that the people may actually walk away with a stronger position than they did walking into it. So you've actually instead of helping, you've actually made it worse, which is
I mean, I think that probably the overemphasis on backfire effects from those early studies did have a negative impact in that it has been used as an excuse to not address misinformation. And the biggest example of that is Facebook once justified not dealing with misinformation flooding Facebook because of the backfire effect. They said, well, if we address it, we could make things worse. And that's not in line with our current scientific understanding. But that kind of early legacy of those early studies has kind of propagated since.
It hasn't gone away. Yeah, I know that, and there's a bunch of other good information that says that actually going out and debunking these myths is good. That you can't just let people propagate nonsense unchecked, because that's severely detrimental to society to do that. And one thing I think that social media has really highlighted is how easy, and the pandemic I should say as well, is how easy it is for nonsense to spread online, like conspiracy theories, misinformation, disinformation, anything that you want to put under the umbrella of false information, that it's spreading faster too than the debunkers and fact checkers can keep up with.
And I think people realize this year more than ever that misinformation is dangerous. It can kill. If people are misinformed about something like COVID-19 and then they go out and behave in ways that endanger their community, that has direct health implications. So
that's certainly that. When you say it can kill, it's not used metaphorically. That is quite literally that it could cost you your life if, or this misinformation can cost people their lives if not properly combated. And unfortunately, I think if you are to, you look at the current numbers here in the United States, could be so much better, but we've had quite a bit of misinformation and just poor leadership due to not acknowledging the science. So that's it's unfortunate, but yeah, people are taking it very seriously now, which is wonderful. But I kind of wish they would have taken this very seriously a decade ago, right? But I suppose there's that one saying, the best time to do something or to take action was 20 years ago. The second best time to do it is today. So now that something's being done about it finally, and people are, when I say people, it's not so much a select few members of like the scientific community, but the public at large finally sees that this is really, really important, that good information, that acknowledging the science, that there's nothing more important than having access to good information. But anyway, okay, so you got a PhD in cognitive science. you're working in global warming, combating misinformation. What did you do after you got your PhD? Did you then decide to like go into academia or stay in academia, I should say? Work is continued on skeptical science, I'm assuming, because there's still plenty of good content coming out. What did your post-PhD look like?
So the answer to the question of misinformation that I found in my PhD was inoculation. So what I came out of from my PhD was the way to neutralize misinformation was to inoculate people. And by inoculation, I mean expose people to a weakened form of the misinformation, explain the techniques used to mislead people, the fallacies, the rhetorical techniques in science denial. And so after my PhD, I pretty much went straight from doing a PhD at the University of Western Australia to getting a job at George Mason University in Virginia. And so I came to the US at the beginning of 2017, and my immediate focus was, how do you put inoculation into practice? How do you develop inoculating messages? And I started working with some critical thinking philosophers to develop a method for taking potential misinformation, deconstructing it, and identifying any reasoning fallacies, any denial techniques in the misinformation, as firstly a way to find out if, assess the veracity of claims, but secondly, as a communication researcher, to identify fallacies in misinformation, and then I can take that content and turn it into an inoculating message.
So you basically found that the antidote to this diseased information, if you will, then is a critical thinking inoculation.
Yeah. I like how you're running with the analogy there. And even to get even more purist with the analogy, I guess you would consider an antidote kind of a cure after the event, right? Inoculating is trying to ideally preemptively get in there and stop it from infecting a person in the first place.
Yes, you are correct. Yes. So antidote isn't quite right. Yeah, using it as an inoculation.
I'm being very nitpicky.
No, it's quite all right. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate precision. So.
But pre-marketing.
Yeah. So the way to get ahead of the game, so to speak. So if you have a diseased information and it's spreading throughout society, similar to how we have infectious diseases like COVID spreading throughout society, and the way to get ahead of the game is to develop an inoculation or a vaccine. But instead of actually having a vaccine where you get an intramuscular injection, this vaccine for the diseased information then is critical thinking, essentially.
Yeah, that's right. We don't have a vaccine for COVID yet, but we do have a vaccine for COVID misinformation. And essentially, it is critical thinking. But more specifically, it's exposing people to a weakened form of the misinformation, saying here are all the different ways that misinformation can mislead you. And once you are aware of these different techniques, those techniques are no longer influential over you. Right? They're basically neutralized. And so the more you can explain the techniques of denial to people and raise their awareness of the rhetorical techniques and fallacies in misinformation, the more inoculated, the more resilient they become and less likely to be influenced.
Okay, so yeah, the critical thinking, acting as the inoculation to various forms of misinformation. I mean, not just global warming, but this can apply to COVID-19 misinformation. This can apply to vaccine misinformation, genetically modified food misinformation. I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to be science, I suppose. It could be all aspects of life. Now, I am curious, what does critical thinking, I suppose, mean to you? So when you say critical thinking, I'm working with philosophers. What exactly is your definition? Because I know it varies slightly depending on the person that you talk to, but there are usually staples to when people say critical thinking, what they mean. But I am curious to hear what critical thinking means to you.
Yeah, that's a good question. And to me, critical thinking is a very broad umbrella, and generally it's about how to assess information, how to think about knowledge, how to assess sources of information, and media literacy is one part of critical thinking. What I'm working on is another subset of critical thinking, which is really, I guess, I tend to call it logic-based critical thinking. I don't have a really good title for it, but it is focusing on where information goes wrong. And or where arguments go wrong, where arguments are fallacious. And it is important to stress that this is not the be all and end all of critical thinking. It's really important that people develop the skills to be able to assess arguments, assess the strength of evidence, be able to determine whether something is right or wrong, or more likely, like whether the evidence supports a position or it doesn't support it. I'm addressing a very specific problem, which is helping people identify attempts to mislead. So it's a very specific mission, so to speak, in contrast to the broader question of how should we assess information at large. It's a very convoluted answer. I hope that's clear.
No, you're fine. You're fine. But I categorically agree with the umbrella. Like critical thinking is an umbrella. When I first started to challenge my own beliefs, so obviously, at one point I didn't think that GMO food, genetically modified foods were safe, or that there was an issue with vaccines. When I actually started to dig in and challenge those, I first did that through learning logic. So I learned what exactly an argument is. So you have the premises, you have the conclusion. Then I learned about how the differences in various types of arguments. So it's like from deductive versus inductive, and where the arguments can go wrong. So this is where like logical fallacies come into play. So there's a bunch of different logical fallacies out there, and all of them render the argument bad for various reasons. And you understand that once you understand, like from a foundational level, how an argument is supposed to be structured from logic within philosophy. So I definitely think that all critical thinkers should have a decent understanding of philosophical logic. At least that's where I started, and I know that I promote that pretty heavily too. That you understand, like from a first principle standpoint, how it is that you structure an argument. So yeah, I mean that definitely needs to be a part of every critical thinker's like toolbox. It definitely needs to be in there. But there's certainly other things too, right? That need to be a part of it. One of them being cognitive biases. I think that it's really important too for people to understand cognitive biases and how they can mislead you. So a cognitive bias, as you know, isn't a logical fallacy, so it doesn't render an argument bad. However, it can distort the way you look at information, and then that distortion then can lead you to structure bad arguments. But I mean, at the end of the day, I suppose what I promote is very similar to what you promote in the sense that it surrounds the argument. Like how do you structure a good argument? And the reason why I chose this particular route is because these arguments that you tell yourselves then go on to direct your life, correct? I mean, like you tell yourselves arguments internally, and then from there you make decisions, and those decisions direct the course of your life. So if you're not able to make good arguments to yourself, then you're not going to be directing your life in an optimal manner. At least that's how I view it. I don't know how you feel about it, but
absolutely. Having studied both fallacies and cognitive biases, it does make it easier to spot them within yourself as well, and then try to avoid them. And it's very difficult for any individual to avoid them, which is why the scientific method is so important. But we can try to self-examine, our own justifications and our own logical processes to conclusions. And let me kind of give you my own science denial, I guess, conversion story as well. Coming from an evangelical background, I believed creationism for a long time. And the thing that got me to even consider whether it might be false or not was when I started studying climate denial and the fallacies in climate misinformation, I approached my uncle. I had a cranky uncle who, he was actually a professional creationist. He made videos, he did it for a living. He would go around trying to get into debates with biologists about creationism versus evolution. So this is his day gig, still is. And I said to him, I'm interested, like I'm just starting to explore this climate change issue and researching misinformation. What do you think about the issue? And he sent me a video that he'd put together himself of a lecture he gave, where he basically argued against climate change and used a whole series of misinformation arguments. And I could see all the fallacies in his video. And that was the kind of moment when I realized, if he's peddling misinformation about climate change, could it be that he's also peddling misinformation about evolution? I started just approaching the issue of creationism and evolution with a more open mind, with the realization that maybe I was being misled by fallacies. And that was what got me examining the empirical evidence for evolution. And once I was able to look at that with a more open mind, it was very obvious that there was many empirical lines of evidence that evolution had happened and creationism was not based in fact. But it was really the fallacies that was the key to me, to, I guess, breaking that ideological hold that was preventing me from objectively looking at the evidence.
Yeah, so it was the understanding of argumentation or logic from logic that really ended up breaking it. Yeah, I think, I mean, out of everything, as far as ways that you can structure your thoughts, I know that they have like mental models, you can know about like cognitive biases, and then there is logic. I think that logic is the most powerful. And the reason why I think it's the most powerful is because it starts from like first principles. How exactly, it's very mathematical in nature, and it's also the underpinning of science. And as you know, as I hope that a lot of people who are listening to this know, I mean, logic it's the best knowledge framework that we have to generate knowledge about the world, or truths about the world. When I say truths, I mean, I'm not talking about like philosophical truth or like a immutable fact, but like something that kind of falls out of the scientific process, scientific fact, that is the best description of reality that we potentially have today. And you know, that can change and be modified as new science comes out, but it's still the best that we can do. So I think that's probably why logic is so powerful, in my opinion. Is it just this first principles thinking, and I think you can appreciate that as a physicist, that first principles thinking of how it is that you structure your thoughts is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, that was one of the things I think I learned from working with these philosophers was thinking through arguments and breaking them down into premises and conclusions, and exploring whether the premises did logically lead to the conclusion. But the other thing that perhaps the most practical thing I took from my collaboration with the philosophers was, it was interesting. Like this, I went into this collaboration as my background was communication at this point, having finished a PhD in psychology and communication. But their background was philosophy. And so we came at it with two different goals. Their goal was, ideally, they would love everyone to basically think like them, right? And that, I guess that's the idea. That's the utopia, that every person considers arguments from a more logical point of view and interrogates whether they're logically valid. And identifies, are there any reasoning fallacies in these arguments that make it potentially misleading? But they also said one thing to me, which was one very accessible way to explain fallacies to people is through the technique of parallel argumentation, which is basically using analogies to explain logic or to explain bad logic. And the technique involved taking some misinformation with a reasoning fallacy in it and transplant that logical flaw into a parallel situation, an analogy. And what that does is it takes what can often be an abstract explanation and makes it concrete, which is the best advantage of analogies in general, whether you're explaining some scientific concept or explaining logic. And I realized while we're doing this collaboration that that's what late night comedians do, like pretty much every night, whenever they're debunking something ridiculous that a public figure says, they'll say, well, such and such said this. Well, that's just like being in this situation and saying the same kind of logical structure. But when you transplant that logic into a more absurd or extreme situation, it becomes very obvious to the layperson that that original argument was logically flawed. And the elegance of that approach is, and the elegance of logic, is that you don't necessarily have to explain all the science in order for someone to see that an argument is flawed. You can use analogies just to show that the logic is flawed.
Okay, that's that's brilliant. I've seen that, obviously. I mean, I've listened to like Stephen Colbert and things of that nature, and other comedians like John Oliver, and how they pick apart politicians with the flawed arguments. But you're right. They use analogies. And do you, in your experience and what these philosophers that you've worked with have said from their own experiences, do they find that it actually works better? So instead of actually using a direct argument and then showing how it's flawed, using an analogy, and then with the analogy, perhaps the analogy is something that the average person can relate to a bit better, and maybe that's why.
That question is what I've been exploring for the last 2 or so years. After I finished the critical thinking work with Peter and David, then I started experimentally exploring different ways of using logic to inoculate people against misinformation, or debunk or pre-bunk. We've tested both. And so we've tried different ways of explaining fallacies in misinformation using analogies, using more of a critical thinking, showing premises in an argument and a conclusion, and identifying where the reasoning fallacy is in the argument structure. Because it's an empirical question, right? Which is more effective. And what we found in one experiment where we showed people tweets of misinformation and then the 2 different types of debunkings afterwards. An analogy in cartoon form or a deconstruction. And the misinformation was actually vaccination. It was the argument that someone got a vaccine and then they suffered this horrible health adverse effect and now they're in a wheelchair and therefore vaccines are very dangerous. And for the logic critical thinking response, we said, well, that argument commits the fallacy of mistaking correlation with causation. Just because 2 things happen close to each other doesn't mean that one caused the other. But with the analogy, we had a cartoon of a guy wearing all green and yellow sports clothing, like the colors of his sports team. And he said, I was wearing green socks when my team won. So if I wear green socks every time my team plays, then we'll always win. So he's mistaking correlation for causation, thinking his green socks caused his team to win the game. Which is an obviously ridiculous argument, right? Although my wife said, people actually believe that, so.
They do, yeah. You'd be surprised how much superstition there is in the sports community.
Right.
My youngest brother, for a while, I don't know if he still does it or not, but he's a huge Chicago Blackhawks fan. And at one point around the dinner table, he was sitting in a certain spot, like a certain chair, and the Blackhawks got beat like really bad, so now he won't sit in that spot during dinner. Like, so. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I mean, with fans, sports fans, and even with the athletes themselves, yeah, there's definitely superstitious type of thinking, and the fallacy being, as you elucidated, the fallacy being committed is the false cause or correlation doesn't equal causation. And you see that a lot with from the vaccine skeptic community or the vaccine denial community, where the vaccines cause autism argument. So hey, my 2-year-old got vaccinated, then they developed autism, or I know of somebody's 2-year-old that got vaccinated, and then shortly after they developed autism. So therefore, vaccines cause autism, and that's committing the correlation equals causation fallacy, which isn't which isn't correct. So
Right.
of course, and then we have the decades of more robust science showing that vaccines are perfectly fine.
Yeah, and so we used eye tracking to measure what people were looking at while we showed them these screens of the tweeted misinformation, and then our 2 different types of tweet responses. And then we did mediation analysis to measure what made, what was the mechanism that changed or had an influence on people. We found that both approaches, the critical thinking approach or the cartoon analogy approach, were both roughly equally effective in neutralizing the misinformation. But the mediation analysis showed us that they were different through different pathways. The critical thinking approach was seen as more credible relative to the cartoon, and that increased credibility was the pathway through which it neutralized the misinformation. But the cartoon, people looked at it more. It held their attention for longer. And that greater attention was the mediator or the pathway through which the cartoon neutralized the misinformation. So what we took from that was there are multiple pathways to countering misinformation. There's no single one answer. And different approaches are effective through different pathways.
Yeah, that's really interesting that they saw that the traditional critical thinking route was taken as more credible, but of course, then the cartoon's more approachable.
Yeah, and also they're more likely to be shared, to be liked, to be commented on, to interact with.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I'm just thinking about it now. A cartoon is very close to a meme, and the internet absolutely loves memes.
Yeah,
absolutely loves them. Yeah, so that's okay. So that's really, really interesting. So I suppose at the end of the day, then you can take a multi-pronged approach. So you can do you can use the cartoons with the more traditional critical thinking routes and combine them to some degree, or use them separately, interchangeably, in order to get your point across. That's fascinating.
Yeah, that's right. There are different approaches, and often different approaches suit different messengers. There was some research coming out of Europe that explored vaccine and climate misinformation by Philippe Schmid and Cornelia Betsch. And they tested 2 different ways of debunking misinformation. The logic-based approach, they called it technique rebuttal, and explaining the science or the facts, which they called topic rebuttal. And they found that both worked, facts or logic. And so their conclusion was 2 things. Firstly, given that different messengers will be more comfortable with a different approach, a climate scientist will probably be more comfortable explaining the climate science rather than going into a philosophical, critical thinking deconstruction of an argument. Whereas people who aren't climate science domain experts might be more comfortable explaining the fallacies in a more kind of less technical kind of way, I guess. And certainly communication and philosophers will be more comfortable with the critical thinking approach. So that was the one thing. Different messages work, and different messengers might be more comfortable with one or another approach. But the second thing they concluded was The logic-based approach has the potential to work across domains. If you explain a denial technique in one area, that can potentially neutralize that technique in other topics. And this is what I also found in my PhD. I inoculated people against a specific denial technique using tobacco misinformation as the example, but found that it inoculated that same technique in climate misinformation. And so researchers call this the umbrella of protection. When you inoculate people, it can spread across issues. And to me, that's another reason why the logic-based approach is so powerful. It can act almost like a universal vaccine against misinformation and potentially inoculate them across the same techniques in lots of different topics.
Yeah, that is a very powerful technique then, particularly if you're talking about a widespread inoculation across various topics. That is, yeah, that's almost that analogy, you teach someone to, you give someone a fish, you feed them for a day, but if you teach them how to fish, you feed them for a lifetime. So if you teach somebody how to think, then they're going to know how to identify flawed arguments for a lifetime in various areas and whatnot. So yeah,
I like that analogy too. The fish teaching.
You like that analogy?
Given that red herring is a common fallacy in misinformation, I might try to see if I can cleverly use a pun in there somehow.
There you go. There you go.
Teach them how to spot a red herring, and then they never mind. Maybe that's a bit false.
Yeah, who knows? Think about it, and try it. Who knows? Anyway. Yeah, I completely agree about the teaching the critical thinking aspect over, let's say, just pointing out why certain facts are wrong. And that's kind of what I focus on, is teaching people how to think, because I think that the positive spillover effects can just permeate all aspects of their life. And I'm not just talking about being better able to identify misinformation online or to identify pseudoscience, but just in general, if somebody knows how to structure good arguments, then they can use that in all aspects of their life in order to make good decisions, right? Because again, decisions are preceded by arguments that you tell yourself. Because you're going to go through all, like, this entire thought process. You're going to tell yourself arguments, I should do this or I shouldn't do this. And then you'll make a decision at some point, and those decisions direct your life. So if you are able to, if you know the techniques in order to be able to tell yourself good arguments, then you should be able to make the best decisions moving forward. I mean, obviously there's, it's not foolproof or anything like that, but you're going to be better suited to make better decisions than the average person if you know these techniques versus those who don't.
Yeah, sure.
And on that topic, I'm curious as to whether or not you think that critical thinking is actually taught enough in schools.
Right.
Or
I mean, it definitely needs to be taught more in schools, critical thinking, not just the narrow spotting misinformation type of critical thinking that I'm working on, but just broader understanding of how science works and understanding how to assess evidence, how to assess information sources, media literacy. Those are more important than ever in this modern day and age with fake news and misinformation and social media the way it is currently. It's crucially important, and especially because the research tells us that people, students and adults, are just not that good at critical thinking at the moment. And I have like a little bit of evidence along these lines. It's like, I know that Stanford have published research measuring students' literacy and finding that it's pretty awful. We've done some pilot studies with a critical thinking game we're currently developing, and we've collected some data in high schools and in undergrad college students, and find that they're pretty much exactly the same in terms of these critical thinking tasks that we're assigning them. So like it's limited data, and you have to take it with a grain of salt, but the impression I get at this stage, and it is backed up by more rigorous research, is that critical thinking is not something that progresses that far from high school to college. I think we need it in college classes as well as in high schools and middle schools.
Yeah, I personally am just kind of blown away that our public education system doesn't have more critical thinking incorporated into it. It's primarily focusing on the memorization and regurgitation of facts, but that we don't teach people how to think. And, particularly like you were saying, with the limited data that you do have or that we do have available, high schoolers, whether they're high school or college undergraduates, they just are not any better at it, and they're actually quite poor at it. And I think that kind of reflects, I think, a lot of people's impressions about how people move through life, and with the media, with social media, et cetera, at identifying good information from bad information. And I'm like, again, going back to the public education system, I just don't understand why these skills aren't taught. It seems like it would just be essential to to be being, a human being in society that makes decent decisions, that you would want, that would be beneficial, and that you would want to do this from a policy standpoint. Like if you were designing public education school curriculums, that critical thinking would be an essential component of it. As somebody that didn't have this, and for a long time was walking around with a distorted worldview, and then wondering why it is that I couldn't justify these things, why I kept, failing in arguments and things of that nature, then eventually learning the skills to become a critical thinker, and then looking back and saying, well, why did I have to go through that entire process? Why didn't society, after everything that we know, just give me these skills when I was going through the public education system? It would just have been so much easier, and you would be inoculating people on a large scale to just fallacious arguments, misinformation, etc., giving them a better foundation to direct their lives through good decisions then.
I mean, absolutely. I think that the good news is that systems like the next generation science standards are making critical thinking more an integral part of the requirements for curriculum. And next generation science standards are being adopted by a wide number of states. And then even individual states that don't use NGSS but have their own standards, we are seeing critical thinking becoming more prominent there. The challenge, though, is that the legacy that teachers are working with is this more memorization and treating students like buckets that we throw facts into. And they are so under pressure to compress so many facts into their tight semesters that it's hard for them to get critical thinking into there as well. So the way I think that we can help that is by providing resources that tick all the fact boxes, as well as integrate critical thinking with all the content that they have to cover as well. That's what I think, like that's what I'm working on, and I've developed curriculum for high schools with the National Centre for Science Education that ticked as many NGSS boxes as possible to make it attractive for teachers, as well as incorporating critical thinking into it. And finally, over the last year, I've been developing this critical thinking game that I mentioned earlier, and talking to climate scientists about it, because it was the primary purpose of the game was to address climate misinformation. And I was talking to climate scientists from their perspective as climate experts, but they're also professors at colleges teaching classes. And what blew me away was just how enthusiastic they were for interactive resources like this that taught critical thinking as well as climate information. And it made me realize that using interactive, engaging exercises like a critical thinking game was a really powerful way to essentially use a game as a Trojan horse to get critical thinking into classrooms. So that's going to be my focus over at least the next year and probably years into the future.
Well, I'm certainly behind you. I mean, it's a noble goal, and clearly the public education system could use more of it. And like you said, figuring out how exactly the resources can be made in order to make them attractive so that teachers actually implement them. I think that that is really, really important for future generations. And then of course we have to make some sort of resources available for the current generation, the consumers of information who are adults now and make, you know, they're out there voting, making really, really important decisions every day. And they don't have the skill set, in my opinion and in my observation, to go through the large volumes of information that we have access to these days and sift through and pick out, you know, the good from the bad. But yeah, there's clearly a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and you put your finger on the challenge. It's inoculating the public is a short-term and a long-term problem. It's a marathon and a sprint, and we need to reach students now for a deep long-term impact, but we also need to inoculate the general public and adults now, because they're being bombarded with misinformation. When I started developing this smartphone game, my original thinking was just that short-term, get it to the public, get the average person playing this game that anyone with a phone can play. And it was only through talking to climate professors that I realized the educational benefits and could see that it is both a short-term and a long-term solution.
But yeah, I certainly can't wait for your game to be available because I certainly want to try it out. Number one, I'm sure that there's still a number of things that I can learn myself, but I definitely would like to get that out to the audience and to friends and family and things of that nature, so that way that they can start playing. What's the name of it? You said it's Cranky Uncle or something of that nature?
Yeah, the game is called Cranky Uncle. You can check it out at crankyuncle.com, or at least check out information about the game, and we've got screenshots there. We're currently beta testing. If you've got an iPhone, I can send you a beta version so you can have a look at it. And yeah, we're hoping that it'll come out sometime November, December. So
November, December,
roughly around the time when this episode comes out, or maybe a week or two later.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I definitely would like to check it out, even if it's the beta version. And for those of you that are tuning in, like John said, it may currently be available, or it may be a few weeks away, but definitely go to crankyuncle.com and check it out, because I think that everyone could use a little bit more critical thinking in their life. And if you've got a fun game on your phone to do it, why not? Why not? But anyway, John, yeah, it's been really fascinating talking to you, getting to know your background, how it is that you came to science, and then, you know, the graphic, your stint in graphic design and how that has come to play a pivotal role in how you communicate science through the cartoons and everything. That's super interesting as well. But then, yeah, I mean, the work is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And I'm a huge proponent, obviously, as somebody who loves to communicate science, and in particular likes to engage in what I call like critical thinking communication, which I think is really, really important, because, well, obviously, you know, all this information, we're seeing the deleterious effects of people not knowing how to figure out what's good, what's bad. They're falling victim to disinformation, to conspiracy theories, fake news, and then they're spreading misinformation themselves, which is, you know, bad information that they don't even realize is bad, and they're just out there and, you know, spreading it around like an infectious disease, if you will, right? Going back to that analogy. So it's interesting times that we find ourselves in, but it's good to know that we have tools at our disposal in order to fight back against it, and then not only fight back against it from a reactive standpoint, but then we can be proactive about it as well through the inoculation method.
Yeah, proactiveness is really important, and even seeing misinformation as an educational opportunity. Teaching science by explaining how that science can be distorted or misconceived is one of the most powerful ways of teaching science. So what you're doing with this podcast and just fostering critical thinking, raising awareness is super important work.
Well, I really appreciate it. It's been a wonderful conversation. Is there anything else as far as like websites or resources that you'd like to tell the audience about that they can go to, that you'd like them to check out? Obviously, your app is coming out, so crankyuncle.com.
If people are interested in climate change, and particularly more the climate science explanations aspect, skepticalscience.com will give you everything you need to know to make sense of almost every climate myth that's out there. We've been building this resource for over a decade, a whole team of people, and we have debunkings on well over 100 different climate myths.
Yes, and I can definitely vouch for you because I've gone to that resource on numerous occasions. It is a fantastic website. Definitely check it out. I also know that you have helped co-author a number of like a debunking handbook. There's handbooks on climate misinformation, and then there's a number of other ones that I can't remember the name of, but they're all wonderful resources. Where can people find those?
That is a good question. We have a URL that I created. I'm just trying to remember what it is. If people go, no, that's not it. Damn. I think if you just Google debunking handbook or conspiracy theory handbook or consensus handbook, you should find our publications. So most of them are published on the Center for Climate Change Communication website, which is climatechangecommunication.org. And yeah, I've been here for the last 4 years. So the Consensus Handbook, the Debunking Handbook 2020, and the Conspiracy Theory Handbook are all published on the Center for Climate Change Communication website.
Okay, perfect. Fantastic. All right. So again, it's been a wonderful conversation. All of those resources that John just mentioned, they'll be linked to in the show notes. So that way you can just click on them and they'll take you right there. You know, debunking misinformation, climate science, it's all very, very important, particularly when it comes to certain scientific consensuses, such as, vaccine safety, GMO safety, and the focus of this particular talk, global warming, because global warming is one of the greatest threats to modern society that we face today. And it's imperative that not only you tuning in know that it's a real threat and that the scientific community has all decades and decades of evidence, and we know how to help, how to mitigate it and to help correct the problem. So it's important that not only you understand it, but that you know the common arguments that you come across for why people may be skeptical of climate change. So that way that you can give them the correct argument, you can help to debunk it, or you can provide the resources. It's just really, really important. But anyway, I really hope that for those of you, again, tuning in, that you enjoyed the conversation between John and I. Plenty of great material on the way. So definitely stay tuned until the next episode. Take care.